Today we're in week 15, and we'll be talking about African politics and colonial legacy. So underneath we have African before European invasion, empires and kingdoms, European invasion methods, patrician apartheid regime, then African resistance and nationalism and its impact. Then we have contemporary issues, human rights, leadership, poverty, migration. So it's quite long, so I will try to just summarize and make things short so that we can finish on time. So the first slide, we're talking about African before the European invasion. How was African before European came into Africa? So now, before the European invasion and colonization of Africa, which started around the 15th century, and when you talk about this colonialism, the first European country to come to Africa were the Portuguese, even before the British, the France, and other European country. So the Portuguese were the first to come to Africa. So the continent was already home to diverse, complex, and advanced civilization. So even before the Portuguese came to Africa, hello, can you hear me? Shit.
Yes, you can hear
I
you.
can hear you.
Okay. Before the Portuguese came to Africa, Africa was already like really very civilized. We were already civilized. And most time you hear stories like British or the Europeans, they came to civilize Africa. That's not true. We're already very, very civilized. We have a lot of advanced things, advanced civilization, even more than the Europeans. So in the African society, they had rich histories, economic system, political structure. And I will talk about the pre-colonial system of Nigeria before um, European came to Nigeria. You could see their well centralized system of government, even not if not all the region, but then the Hausa, they were really well centralized, and then the Yoruba, they have semi-centralized system of government. So these things were already in place. It's just that the European, they just came to refine it. That's what I was saying. But then we were already like very civilized. And most things they got most of their development from Africa. From Africa. So Africa was not really in a dark continent. So you not say there was no development. Everything was in place. Everything was in place. We had different rich history, economic structure, even down to when you talk about writing, medication, it all sprouts from Africa. So the first country I will discuss here is ancient Egypt, which is the northern Africa. And civilization started from Egypt. When you talk about civilization of Africa, it started from Egypt. Egypt were very, very well developed country. So civilization actually sprouts from Egypt. So they are known for their pyramids, their hieroglyphics, medicine, and governments. Proper, you could see Pharaoh. They already have centralized system of government. They have medicine. Most of the drugs, medication that we got today, all the scientific stuff came from Egypt. They were well developed. Then we'll talk about the Kingdom of Kush. I have to be fast so that we'll finish in time. They were known for it's a modern Sudan, now modern Sudan. They were known for their powerful Nubian kingdom that once ruled Egypt. They once ruled Egypt. Then another developed country we'll talk about is the Carthage. It's a wealthy city with advanced maritime trade. They deal on trade. Then we have the Ghana Empire, the Wendy Empire known for gold, even up to now, it's known for gold. Then we have the Mali Empire, which is the West Africa. They were famous for what? Massa Musa, one of the richest men in history. We have other well-developed country. Oh, sorry, I omitted something here. But this number 5 is Mali Empire. Mali Empire, West Africa. Then we have the Soga Empire, we have the Great Zimbabwe, and we have the Ethiopia Empire. All these are African countries that were civilized even before the invasion of um, colonialism, before the invasion of European coming to Africa to feel like, okay, they are coming to develop. Not really. Their main aim was because of economic exploitation. That was the main aim European came to Africa, was just for economic exploitation, because they discovered that, oh, Africa is well rich and well developed, and they wanted a more suitable economic development, and then they came to Africa to explore what they already have. Then another this thing we'll talk about is the European invasion of Africa. The European invasion of Africa. I believe they might have taught you this. So when you talk about the European invasion of Africa, which is the Scrabble for Africa, also called a patrician of Africa, the conquest of Africa, or the rape of Africa. So was the invasion, the division, colonization of most African countries by the 7 European power. The 7 European power. We know of Britain, France, the Portuguese, Berlin, and so on. So the Berlin Conference of 1884, which regulated European colonization and trade in Africa, is usually accepted as the beginning of the invasion of Africa. And that Berlin Conference was held in the 19th century, where they deliberated on how to share Africa between the different colonial countries, the different European countries. So the sharing of Africa is known as Scrabble, is known as patrician, is known as rape. So those are the names. So when you talk about Scrabble, what is Scrabble? So Scrabble refers to a condition where people struggle in hurry or in haste to obtain something. Like the European people, they were actually struggling for what? To take different parts of African countries, especially the places that were well developed. So that's Scrabble. They refer to the condition where people struggle in hurry or in a haste to obtain something. Competing nations try to defeat, outmaneuver, or overtake their opponent in controlling or getting something from a rivalry. So first to come, first to serve. That was how they were just fighting to get. Remember, even though the Portuguese, they were the first, they could not exploit the whole of Africa, because Africa is a very big continent. So they could not really exploit the whole places. And different European countries started coming when they discovered, oh, this place is where developed. They started coming. And due to the fact that, okay, people were coming from different European countries, there could be disagreement, argument of who were the first to exploit the land. So for that reason, you have to divide the country. That was the Berlin Conference they had in 1884. Now, in patrician, we also Define partition refers to the sharing or dividing up of materials. That's the definition of partition. But then if you relate it to the sharing of Africa, you could say is the dividing of different African countries between the Europeans. Between the Europeans. Then partition of Africa, that's the definition. So it refers to the dividing up of region in Africa among the Europeans' power. Among the Europeans' power. Now, we move to the reason for European expansion into Africa. Why did they actually come? Why were they in Africa? They came for different reasons, and one of the reasons is for economic exploitation. That's the most important reason why European people actually came to Africa. Now, when you talk about the economic interests, like during those times, the European powers, they promote their business and economic interests. So there was an industrial revolution which took place in Britain in the 18th century and which later extended to France, Germany, etc., and resulted in mass production of goods which had to be sold. So the European market could not actually absorb those goods. They don't have enough quality goods, and then they have to come to Africa. And they need a lot of raw materials, such as they need palm oils, they need granules to actually boost their industry. And those things, they could not actually produce them. They could not actually produce them. Then they discovered that, okay, Africans, they are producing excess of it. For that reason, they came to Africa to exploit their natural resources. So that's one of the reasons, economic interests, because different growth in their industrial, and they could not even produce enough raw materials, enough resources, and there were a lot of competition between different European countries. So they have to come to Africa where they could produce excess of materials, excess of raw materials, resources for their business, for their industries. Now we also have the political control. They also came because they feel they are inferior to African people. You know, where they came, they already have little development. And so coming to Africa, they feel, okay, we're inferior to them, we are superior to them. So since they feel they are superior to us, they try to want to control us politically. Like when they came, even though they came for economic purpose, you could see they were actually heading most part of the country. They were heading them. When we talk about the what's it called, the constitution, let's use Nigeria as an example. When we talk about the different development of constitution, you could see even the legislative council, the European, they dominate it. Even Nigerians were not even allowed to participate in any position because they have more powers. They dominate almost the legislative council, the executive council, they were part, they just really, but then they have their motive why they came to Africa. Their competition, like I said, in the European empire, they were already like competing, different competition based on their production of goods, their industrial growth. They were already competing among themselves, the best producing industry. So for that reason, they have to come to exploit most part of Africa due to competition. You know, in market, people tend to compete with one another. So that's another reason. The establishment of commercialization, sorry, it's supposed to be communication link between them and other people, the people they are making sales to. Their need for security, they were trying to protect their markets, to protect their industry. For that reason, they have to bring more European people. And the abolishment of slave trade, the missionaries were also part of this movement, why the Europeans came to Africa, was because they wanted to abolish slave trade. And so they brought missionaries. They brought missionaries from their country to come and what develop Africa, to come and put an end to slave trade, to preach Christ, and then for people to start embracing Christ, and then put an end to slavery. So with that abolishment of slave trade and the missionaries coming to Africa, we had a lot of European coming, not actually because they really want to stop slave trade. They were also coming for economic interest. So those were their purpose. So when we talk about the reason why European invade Africa, we said one of the reasons is economic interest, which is the most important reason why they actually came to Africa. And then we have the political control, competition within the Europeans, the establishment of communication, need for security, and also abolishment of slave trade. I think that was one of the benefits of these European people coming to Nigeria, was this abolishment of slave trade and then bringing missionaries to Africa. The strategies used by Europeans to acquire colonies in Africa, what were their strategies? Did they just come to Africa like that empty handed? No, they have different strategies, because you can't just come and say you want your land and then you expect people to just start giving their land. No, they have different strategies. What were the strategies? Can you guys hear me? Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So what are the strategies used by Europeans to acquire colonies in Africa? One of the strategies was signing of treaties. Signing of treaties. What is treaty? A treaty is a binding formal agreement between two or more entities. It's a binding agreement between two or more entities.
Excuse me,
That
ma'am.
must be
Ma'am, please
ratified by the
excuse me.
parties involved.
Excuse me, ma'am.
So, okay.
Rosita, can you please mute your mic?
Can you can't hear me very well?
No, I can hear you. I can hear you. I can hear you. Don't worry, go on.
Okay. The strategies used by Europeans to acquire colonies was signing of treaties. And I said treaty is like a binding, not like, okay, it's a binding formal agreement between two or more entities. So the Europeans use signing of treaties. They sign treaties with the local leaders among themselves, the local leaders, the heads among themselves. So they sign an agreement with them. And then another thing they used was military conquest. Military conquest. Now, this approach we actually use whenever treaties making failed. Maybe they want to sign treaties and they say, okay, this agreement, we want you to agree that we'll give you this and you give us this. And then when the people refuse, they have to what? Use military conquest by fighting the people. You know, they brought different arms with them, guns, different listing with them. So they have to use force on the people. Then we also see Patiri said diplomacy. Diplomacy is like a peaceful negotiation between two territories. That's diplomacy. Just a peaceful negotiation. No fight, no war, peaceful discussion between two entities. So they use those methods. Then they use tricky, trickery. They use trick, and trick involved like luring African people with gifts. They were actually luring African people with gifts. They gave them clothes, things that they've not seen before, tools, weapon, intoxicated things like drinks, gin, dry gin, all those things. So they were actually using those things to actually deceive them so that they can give them their land. They can give them their land. Most of the time, most of them haven't seen a lot of things. So they just use those ones to just deceive them, lure them, and then they will give their land. We also have company rules. Company rules. Like before, we have the Royal Niger Company, we have the British South African Company. All these companies were just used to just deceive people to just give their land. Then we have missionaries. Missionaries came to Africa. When the missionaries came, they asked for land now to build their churches. They converted a lot of Africans to Christianity, and then with that, they win them. They won them. According to Kamas, if you've read the conflict theory of religion, you see how using these missionaries to trick people, they tend to, like when the Europeans are maltreating them, they won't even want to fight back because they believe, okay, we're suffering for Christ and the rest. So all those kind of things, they use it to deceive them and then take part of their land and then lure them into agreeing to whatever they asked them to do. So these were the strategies the European actually used to acquire colonies in Africa. This was what they used. Then the next, we have the factors that led to the scramble and partition of colonies in Africa. I think we've discussed this. Like I said, the economic reason was part of it, political reason, and social reasons, like I previously said. Then impact of the partition of Africa, even though the European came to invade Africa, at least they still brought some good things. So the partition of Africa have several effects to both African and European as follows: abolishment of slave trade, abolishment of slave trade. So it was due to European coming to Africa that they were able to abolish slave trade. How did they do this? By introducing missionaries. You know, when they are preaching Christ, they tell you slavery is it's a sin. You don't sell people, kill them for money or for other gains. So they actually abolished slave trade. Like we have one of the important person in Nigeria is Mary Celeste. She stopped the killing of twins. Aside slave trade, they actually stopped a lot of abnormal practice in Africa, like the killing of twins in Calabar. Mary Celeste stopped the killing of twins. So also drawing of boundaries in Africa. Drawing of boundaries in Africa. So they created a lot of boundaries in Africa. Created a lot of boundaries in Africa. Why? Because during the Berlin Conference of 1888, I told you how they divided African country among themselves. The Portuguese, they took one part, France took another part, Britain took another part. So this invasion of Africa by the European actually made Africa to be divided because they shared African among themselves. Then the spread of Christianity, also part of abolishment of slave trade, missionaries, introducing missionaries to Africa, and then it actually led to the spread of Christianity because a lot of people came to embrace Christianity. And then introduction of Western education. Actually, for the Britain, yes, the Western education was introduced, but then when you go to the French countries like Cote d'Ivoire and the rest, when you talk about introduction of education, it was really hard because they were practicing assimilation. It was very, very hard because they were trying to force their culture on African people. So they don't really want them to be educated so that they will be aware or their eyes will be open to what the whites were doing to them. So when it comes to education, it was really difficult. But in the Britain region, the Britain territory, yes, education was really something they promoted. The improvement in agriculture, they brought a lot of equipment to Africa for the agriculture, even though it was for their own benefit. But then those like cutlass, different method, bulldozer, all those things actually made agriculture easy actually made agriculture very easy for those people that were cultivating and then producing different raw materials. Then some communities were split into different countries, like for example, Nigeria. Nigeria, when they came, we talk about we talk about amalgamation of Nigeria, where Lord Lugard actually divided Africa, splitted Nigeria into different regions. Sorry, he brought Nigeria to try to unite the different region and the rest. And it's also they also splitted the region because in regional constitution we discovered that the regions were split into northern, western, and eastern region. So different communities were actually divided, they were splitted. So these are the benefits of or the several effects of um, the partition of Africa for both African and European. The next one is the apartheid period. Now, this one is not in Nigeria anymore. This one is now focusing on South Africa. South Africa. So when you talk about the apartheid period refers to a time in South Africa, which is 1948 to 1994. It started in 1948 and ended in 1994, when the government led by the white minority, mainly Afrikaners, institutionalized a system of racial segregation and discrimination. In the Britain colony, it wasn't really that serious compared to those in South Africa. It wasn't really serious. So there were racial segregation, discrimination against majority Black South African and others non-white group like Indians and the rest. So what is apartheid? Apartheid is an Afrikaner's word meaning apartness. It was a set of laws and policies that physically, socially, and politically separated races. They separated races. That's apartheid. So we have different major features of apartheid. Different measures of and when you talk about the apartheid period, you know, in where why Nigeria's and other British colonies were actually developing, this was what really hindered most of the development in South Africa, because they were not allowed to actually speak up. They were not allowed to speak out when other countries were already having their political party to drive out the colonial masters. South Africans were still under their rules, were still under bondage, were still under racial segregation and discrimination. So until later on, different political parties sprang up, like the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the Black Consciousness Movement. All these were different political parties that helped to fight these colonial rules in South Africa, and that was when they got their first president, Nelson Mandela, became the first Black president of South Africa. Everybody know Nelson Mandela. So he was one of the person that actually fight for peace, unity in South Africa, and freedom for South Africa. The major features of apartheid: we have Population Registration Act of 1950, Group Area Act of 1950, Pass Law, Bantu Education Act, Prohibition of Mismarriages Act. All these are the major features of apartheid regime. Then we have response to European colonization, response to colonial European, African response to European colonization. I hope you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. There were There was resistance from across different parts of the continent by various group of people. Yeah, different resistance. That was when we talk about nationalism. We'll come there. So the resistance, what did they actually use? What was African response to European colonization? One was resistance, war and military resistance. Sometimes these include attempt to draw upon supernatural solution to avoid or undo conquest. Then another one is acquiescence, agreement or consent without protest, silence, passiveness over an extended period of time. Then we have alliance. Sometimes it was possible to join with the European in conquest of neighbors, often traditional enemies, and the rest. Then we have negotiation. They negotiated. All these were African response to European colonization. I think one of the major one was nationalism, which we are going to discuss. But before then, what is neocolonialism? We're supposed to talk about um, nationalism before this, but then let's just continue. So when you talk about neocolonialism, it's defined as the indirect control of the economic, political, and social-cultural life of colonized country by their by their former colonial masters. Now, when you talk about colonialism, it was indirect control of the people, indirect control of the people, and it's often for economic exploitation when you talk about colonialism. When you talk about neo-colonialism, it's different from colonialism. Now, let me explain it in a more simpler way. Neocolonialism is where now, like Nigeria, they've gained independence, isn't it? And we said we are free from colonial controls, but they are indirectly controlling us. Why? Because most time we still depend on them for most of the things we do: resources, materials, security. We're even still borrowing money from them. Even our education is just the same with because it's what colonial they brought. That's what we're still using till up to now. We don't even want to change our system of education. Whereas you could see the China, they are already well developed. You see little children, they know how to make things, to produce things. They do more practical rather than theory. But then Nigeria will still depend on the education that the European they introduced to us, because those education introduced to us, they actually introduced those education not because they want us to grow, but they want us to work for them. They want us to be slave to them. That's why most of the time they did not teach us how to actually produce those things. We just have to read, learn, read, learn, read without producing. Most time when people graduate, they'll be looking for a job because they don't even have any handwork to fall back to. Maybe you're learning electrical engineering in school. Most time they don't even teach you the practical work. They don't teach you very well. You only come to class, you copy notes and the rest. So all of these are still a way we're still under it's still a way of still like the colonial masters are still controlling us. Because then you see people leaving the country instead of developing the country and going outside the country to go and develop other countries and leaving our own behind. In a way, they are still controlling us. They are still controlling us. So when you talk about new colonialism, like it's defined as the indirect control of economic, political, social cultural life, we still think like the Europeans. We want to dress like them, forgetting our own culture. People want to be dressing the English way. In a way, they are controlling us. They are controlling our cultural life without us knowing, because we want to look like them, we want to dress like them, we want to look sexy like them. When you talk about political rules, sometimes we still depend on them. Economic, we still even depend on them, rely on them for different production of things. You don't see things made in Nigeria. You hardly even see things you buy. They always export and they will pay money. Export. What can actually produce all of these things, but then we depend on European people for their goods, and then we import and export. When we can actually put an end to that thing, and African within ourselves can just be exporting things within African countries, but then we tend to look and want to export things from the European. So that's neocolonialism in a way. Even though we we've gained independence, we feel we are free from their rule, their control. They are still indirectly controlling us. They are still indirectly controlling us. So that's neocolonialism. That's neocolonialism. But when it comes to colonialism, it's indirect. We know they are within, they are around us, controlling us directly by what? Even outside controlling, they are actually here for economic exploitation. So, how neocolonialism manifests? How do they manifest? Like I said, economic dependence. Economic dependence. We still depend on them for different production of goods, different product. We see export and the rest. Cultural domination. We still dress like them. We want to look like them. We watch movie and see the way they live their life, and we want to behave like them, forgetting our own culture. Then I talk about the education system based on colonial models, what they introduced. That's what we're still using till now, up to date. When other countries have moved far ahead, African, we're still depending on the system of education that were introduced to us by the European people. We don't want to go beyond that. When other countries, they've started producing things, producing different type of instruments, producing things to develop their countries, we will still depend on carrying books, reading books, studying, filling our head with different knowledge without experimenting those ideas. That's colonial neocolonialism for you. Then we move to the nationalist movement in West Africa. I hope you guys can hear me. Hello.
You can hear you.
Okay. So now we move to the nationalist movement in Africa. Nationalist movement in Africa. Nationalism is the African context may be defined as the struggle for Africans to free themselves from foreign rules, to free themselves from foreign rule, and to determine after independence has been won their own future. That's nationalism. African country trying to free themselves from foreign rules, from colonial rules, and then decide what their future will be after they gain independence. So, in the period before the Second World War, nationalism was aimed at resolving certain grievances of the elite. You know, the education elites, they were actually excluded from different things because the colonial masters, they felt those people were actually intimidating because they were actually educated, so they excluded them from a lot of things. So it was actually these educated people, elites, and those freed slaves and those people that went to war. They were actually the people that came back, especially those slaves that returned from Europe. They were actually the ones that stood up for nationalist movement because they actually saw how the European, their way of life were, how they were living, and then they tend to, okay, our country can also be like this. Why not we introduce this? Why would they be dominating and controlling us when we have our own say? And then they came back and were actually, they organized this nationalist movement. So the nationalists demand better prices for agricultural commodities and fair treatment for African business persons and merchants in their competition with European who dominated the economy because the European were actually dominating the economy. Even when we have good things, materials, they were actually still dominating. So Africa wanted to represent a representation in the Legislative Council that usually had the European majority. Like I said before, most of the the legislative and the executive council were actually dominated by the Europeans. Africans were not involved in policies making of their own country. Imagine you are in your own house and somebody coming from outside nowhere, you don't even know the person, saying you want to be making decision in your own house. It's not possible now. So that's what it was. African also they wanted the representation in the legislative council. They wanted to make decisions. They wanted to be involved. I think Africans and Nigeria started making the first constitution that Nigeria actively participated was the Macpherson Constitution of 1954, if I'm not mistaken. Is it 1954? 1951, yeah. So all these were actually drive. And one thing that really helped this nationalist movement was political party, the development of political party. And in the previous class, we talked about the first political party. That's NNDP. The NNDP was the first political parties founded by Abat Macaulay. So these political parties were actually a drive towards independence of Nigeria. Now, introduction to nationalist movement. What is nationalist movement? Now, nationalist movement is the coming together of various ethnic groups to force colonial government to grant independence to their empires. So when you talk about nationalism is them fighting to free themselves from foreign rules, from colonial rules, and determine after independence what their future will be, Then in nationalist movement is a coming together of various ethnic groups to force colonial government to grant independence. It's a different thing. Nationalism, they fight to free themselves from colonial rules and determine what their future will be after independence. But this one, it's not a coming together of different ethnic groups. Let's work together if we want to end the policy of this colonial rule, colonial empire. Let's come together. So it's not a coming together of different ethnic groups to force colonial masters off seat. So the various cultural groups had diverse beliefs and customs, but they were able to combine forces to fight the colonial powers using the elites as front. The elite did not only provide the leadership, they coordinated, organized, and sometimes confronted the colonial master with genuine reasons why they should be given independence. Not now that we have different ethnical rivalry differences, and like somebody asked the other time, why did military overthrow the civilians? It was because of ethnical rivalry, ethnical difference. But before then, even before the independence of Nigeria, they were actually united. Different parts of Africans were united because their goal was one. They have one goal, one aim, and that aim was to gain independence, to drive out colonial people. But now, different um, um, rivalry among different ethnic groups. So therefore, nationalist movement can be defined as the association of people with common interest who organize themselves to resist political and cultural domination and engage in a struggle for independence. There were nationalist movements in Nigeria and in the whole West African sub-region. You can see not just only Nigeria, but different African countries coming together for the struggle of independence. Now, the nationalist movement in British West Africa, we have the National Congress of British West Africa. National Congress of British West Africa, that is NSBWA, NCBWA. So this National Congress of British West Africa was founded in 1917. Take note, please. Was founded, you can see this in your objective question, was founded in 1917. What's the time? Was founded in 1917 and was one of the earliest nationalist organization in West Africa. The earliest nationalist organization in West Africa. Remember, their aim is to what? Push for independence of different African countries. of African countries. So they were founded in 1917 and the earliest nationalist organization in West Africa. And they were working towards what the emancipation of Africa. Now, this group were not just ordinary groups; they were composed of educated elites, especially in Gold Coast, who felt threat for what these European authorities. So, what was their aim? What did they actually do? What did they actually do? They actually involved in self-administration. They established university in West Africa. They advocate for press freedom, freedom of press, fought for political parties. These were most of their aim was what they were fighting for. Freedom of press, um, independence of the country, self-determination, self-rule, self-independence, and the rest. Then we talk about they also, like I said, introduce elective principle. We have the first political party. They established newspaper, different political parties. Then they also fought for African to what? To gain part in the legislative council. To gain part in the legislative council. Then we also have the West African Students Union. The West African Students Union. And it was formed in August 1925. It was the students in different parts of the country, especially students that were studying outside the country, actually formed this Western African Students Union. Formed it, those studying in the United Kingdom, because they were seeing how those countries were actually well developed, and they were actually bitter. The African was not so. So the different countries, the different African countries that were studying in the United Kingdom actually formed this West African Student Union, and it was founded in 1925. Then we have the Nigeria Youth Movement. It was one of the strongest this thing. Then we have nationalist movement. We had the Nigeria Youth Movement, and it was founded in 1935. 1935. You can do more research on that. I'm not very certain, but it was founded in 1935. 1935. Now, they actually fought for independence of Nigeria, for better pay of civil servants who were citizens. Those were just there. They should pay them very well. If they are working, they have to be well paid. The another one, we have the Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a worldwide movement, that aims to encourage and strengthen the bond of solidarity among all peoples of Africa. Then we have the method used by nationalist leaders in their struggle against British administration. What did they actually use to fight the colonial people? They used newspaper articles, different articles, publishing articles. That's why they were fighting for free press, so that they could express themselves. So I think we have the Lagos Pilot newspaper, something like that. We have I think that was the first newspaper that was actually established in 1923. Then they also use strike, boycott, protest, and the rest. Seminars, symposium, constitutional conference, coming together to hold different constitutional conference for reformity. So these were the method the nationalist movement used. Now, factor that promoted nationalist activities in West Africa before World War II. What actually made Africans to stand up for their rights, for their independence, was the exclusion of Africans from economic activities. especially the educated elites. They did not allow them to participate in any economic activities at all because the European dominated everything. They dominated everything. Then employment, those who were educated, those who traveled out of the country, they got Western education, came back to Africa. They were not given employment. They were not given employment. And this was what actually moved them to what? These nationalist movement, to form different nationalist movement. Then the role of ex-slaves, like I said, those people that were outside the country, they were slaves. When they return back, they actually compare what Africa had with what Europe had. Like their lives were actually different. They ruled themselves. They were self independent. They rule themselves. They make decisions. They have strong political rules, administration. And yet Africans are not so. So they actually were the people also that fought towards independence of Africa. Then discrimination in the public service. Africans were actually discriminated. They were not given good positions, especially the educated elites. And this was what pushed them towards the nationalist movement. Then the educated elite, since they were educated, they know their rights, they actually fought for it. So these were the activities that actually the factors that promoted the nationalist activities in West Africa. Factors that affected the rise and growth of nationalism after the Second World War, development of Asia. Like African, they discovered that okay, Asia countries like the India, they are well self-independent. They've gotten their independence. So what's deriving us from fighting for our rights and gaining our own independence? And when they saw other development of Asia, their countries, they're gaining independence, they have to fight for their own independence as well. Africa have to fight for their own independence. The activities of students abroad, like I said, those people that were schooling abroad, they actually saw the different system. They saw the way those people, their lives were actually the way those Europeans, they live their life. And then they tend to want to promote the same thing in Africa. Then we have the discrimination in civil service. Like I said before, Africans were not even like we're not given good positions, even with their education. Even with their education, they were limited to a lot of things, a lot of privilege they were not given. The establishment of political parties like the NNDP, the first political party in Nigeria, actually promoted this nationalist movement and actually was what led to independence of Nigeria, most especially. But when all this was happening, South Africans were still under this assimilation, this apartheid regime. Even when West Africa started developing their political parties, they were not still well developed. They were still under those France. The exclusion of Africans from the economy, they are not allowed to participate in any economic development, anything, even making decisions, they were not allowed. They dominate almost part of everything. So this was what the factors that affected the rise of nationalism after the Second World War. Then now we'll turn to human rights. I hope you guys can hear me. Hello.
We can hear you, man.
I hear
Okay.
you.
Hope I'm not too fast. I hope you guys understand what I'm explaining. So we'll talk about human rights. Human rights all the time. We talk about human rights in Africa, in Nigeria, most especially. So human rights are universal and apply to everyone. Human rights. Everybody have rights, freedom of movement, speech, religion, and the rest. So they establish that all human beings, irrespective of countries, culture, context, are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Like we have the rule of law. Nobody is above the law. Whether you're a president, you're a citizen, you are equal to the task. But then, do we really promote that human rights in Africa, most especially in Nigeria? We don't even know about what's it called? This rule of law does not even count when it comes to rule of law. Does not count. But then human rights is something that is actually human rights have to be respected. Everybody dignity. I think we promote that in Nigeria. So fundamental human rights can be referred to as those inalienable natural rights and privileges enjoyed by citizens of a given state, which are usually stated in the constitution. Yeah, constitution, it actually states. So you don't have the right to take on that person's life. You don't have the right to restrict somebody's, like if you restrict, they will say is um you're restricting somebody's right of movement. Restricting somebody's right of movement. You don't have the right, except for a good reason. For a good reason.